Hey, everybody. Welcome to Two Moons and a Microphone and SyFy Sisters podcast, ElfQuest Fangirl podcast. And today I'm very excited. I have Elf Bro here, David Mizejewski. He is the director of community content and promotions for Warp Graphics. Folks in the Facebook, the ElfQuest Facebook group know him as David Charles Thornbreak on Twitter or X, whatever, and all around Elf Bro friend and host of the ElfQuest Show podcast, which is on a little hiatus, but I was lucky to be a guest host with David. So now David is here to be a guest with me. It's so exciting. It's full circle. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Tanya. Yes, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say full circle. So I am really excited to be here as a guest, sort of the reverse. And I am so excited and so thrilled for Two Moons and a Microphone. You're doing such an awesome job. And it's so great to have yet another ElfQuest podcast out there. The world needs more of them. And this one's, pretty awesome. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. That means a lot, really. I really appreciate that. And all the support that you and Wendy and Richard have given to Two Moons and a Microphone is just like have me like totally over the moons. I'm very excited to have all of your support and for you to be here to offer all of your expert opinions on ElfQuest monsters because you are an expert on creatures of many kinds in your real life. So this is going to be a great geek out fest.
Yes, I am. I was extra stoked when this was the topic that you asked me to join you about, because you're right. For folks that don't know, I'm a naturalist by profession beyond all of my ElfQuest stuff. So I work for the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm a lifelong nature geek, and I love animals. And I have always also loved monsters because I feel like they obviously sort of have an animalistic quality to them. And oftentimes they're just like the coolest designs, the coolest characters. A lot of times they are portrayed as evil, but I think oftentimes just like real wildlife, that narrative is really one based in kind of ignorance and prejudice and sort of a certain point of view that is very one-sided. So the idea of monsters has always appealed to me. And I have a lot of thoughts on monsters and ElfQuest. So I'm excited to get into it.
Oh, I can't wait. Let's get into it. Okay. So I had a couple of slides of some examples, but I'm sure there are a lot of different kinds of monsters in ElfQuest. But let's start with the most recognizable, scary monster, Mad Coil from the original quest. I think we have a slide for the folks in the chat to see. And
looks like,
wow. Okay. Well, anyway, maybe it's not coming up. All right.
Yeah, that said in the private chat here that she's not sure what slide. I don't know if you can see that or not.
It's the first slide. Oh gosh, I had sent slides and I tried to be so on it because I knew you were coming on, David. Did you see my slides?
I did not. I'm not sure when you sent them though.
Oh, I sent them Thursday as requested.
I don't recall getting slides, but
I shared some Google slides. I'm a Google person. We're very Android here at the Thomas residence. Anyway, so while we're waiting, we could talk about Mad Coil because its origins are from this dark pool of magic that the first comer elves had left. I mean, they're heartbroken. They've been attacked by humans. They're trying to get their magic to work on this primitive planet, and it goes wrong. And there's just this pool of their alien energy in this part of the forest, and it's feeding off of emotions from the elves and the humans and their conflict, and then what is it? It's like a snake and some kind of panther?
Yeah, it's like basically the ElfQuest equivalent of a saber-toothed cat, which the Wolf Riders would call a long tooth.
Right, yes. And they've somehow merged together into this extremely terrifying creature that is just out for destruction and to just decimate humans, elves, other creatures in the forest. And it is the scariest thing because it can also send.
Yeah. The thing about Madcoil is that it's a great example of sometimes a monster is just a monster. It is sort of, pure evil. And this is something that I've learned to appreciate somewhat through Wendy Pini herself, because I have come to see the role of the monster in the story is actually something that's really important. And yes, like I was just saying a minute ago, I do appreciate kind of flipping the table and seeing things through the eyes of the monster, and those type of narratives that help us sort of kind of see beyond our own prejudices. I think that's really sort of the goal of that kind of flip the script, if you will. But Wendy is pretty old school, and has just sort of a real love and appreciation for a good villain. And sometimes that is to be celebrated. And so Madcoil is I think a perfect example of that. But even with that said, as you were just explaining, there's sort of still more to the story there. And I love how that kind of played out in ElfQuest, because Madcoil was introduced pretty early on, sort of in a flashback. You hear the story of how Madcoil decimated the tribe, and how Bearclaw essentially almost killed it, and then Cutter kind of finished the job, and that was how Cutter became chief of the Wolf Riders, all of that, right? And many years later, in the 90s, like probably 15 to 20 years later, Wendy teamed up with Christy Marks, who is most well known as the creator, I believe, of Gem and the Holograms. Yeah.
Shut up.
She wasn't the creator. I'm pretty sure she's the creator. I know she was sort of like the main writer, but I'm pretty sure she was the creator. At any rate,
Gem and the Holograms. I still have a VHS tape. I have a cousin. This is short. My cousin used to work for People magazine, and somehow she had this like preview of a Gem and the Holograms episode on VHS, and she gave it to me, and I still have it, even though I do not have a VHS player. Okay.
Right. Amazing. Well, speaking of, villains, the Misfits were always pretty awesome.
So cool. I had a Misfits t-shirt and I wore it to death.
I love it. But yeah, so Wendy teamed up with Christy Marks to write the story known as Wolf Rider. And that story is a little bit more of like the origin story of Madcoil. And in that story, we kind of learned that it wasn't just a monster, right? It was actually something that both the humans and the elves created in their animosity and hatred for each other. And so, yes, it's magic gone bad. And, the idea that magic is really just energy, I think is really sort of a core aspect of ElfQuest. And that was one of the first times that was really addressed in ElfQuest, I think. There we go.
There we go. I mean, look at this thing. It is... the thing about it is that when Wendy draws anything, it's always got a beauty to it. Like you can see her line of beauty with the S shapes, and it's terrifying, but it's also beautiful because it's Wendy Pini, I think.
Well, you know what? Yes. And at some point, maybe we'll have another whole podcast about that, because even the scary, even the disgusting, when Wendy portrays those things, which she does very powerfully, there's always, at least to my eye, an element of beauty, even if it's scary beauty, even if it's disgusting beauty. So that image of Madcoil and Bearclaw fighting is quite honestly one of my favorite pieces of ElfQuest art. It's just so awesome. But yeah, so Mad Coil is like I guess ElfQuest's answer to like the standard dragons and other creatures like that in conventional fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's again just another example of the creativity and that Wendy and Richard put into ElfQuest, and one of the things that kind of makes it different, because there isn't anything actually like Mad Coil that I know of in other fantasy worlds, right? It's this sort of mishmash monster created by both magic that went bad that the elves created themselves, and then this hatred that caused the mutation, and then it turns around and it slaughters both the humans and the elves that created. So there's this weird, very sad kind of poetic justice, and sort of this message that this is really the core message, I think, of the Wolf Rider story, that sort of vendettas and kind of like racial hatred or hatred against another group just cause they're different is never gonna, like, you're gonna kill yourself in the process. And it's there's a lot there.
Yeah, everything that you put out is going to come back to you in some way,
right,
good or bad. So it goes back to like treating others as best you can, and
right,
being kind when you can't, like trying to be kind, and because all of that energy is going to go somewhere and affect you. So
right. I
it's so deep.
also Yeah, it is. It's very deep. It's Mad Coil is the obvious first place to start, but it's also the one with the most to talk about. And something just struck me too as we were just talking, and I was thinking about, again, sort of the whole idea of vendetta and hating another group, and just sort of blindly hating them and wanting to kill them just because that's how it's always been, and how in the real world that is such a sort of a like a male thing, and how like you think of like the mafia fighting families, right? And it's always the men killing each other, right? And Mad Coil was created by the hatred of these two sort of very aggro male characters, the human spirit man and Bear Claw, right?
Yeah.
And I like the Wolf Rider story. To me, one of the most powerful parts is Joyleaf actually standing up to Bear Claw. And when Bear Claw goes and kills the elder shaman in that story as revenge for the killing of Strongbone Moonshade's daughter Crescent, he basically is like just deepening this vendetta where it's like, I kill you, you kill me, and Joyleaf basically reads him for filth and is like, did that bring Crescent back? You've only made it worse. And that is such female power to me, and perspective and energy. And so anyway, that just sprung into my head as we were talking, and I thought it was worth noting because it is part of the story of Mad Coil. Like in many ways, Mad Coil was formed by like toxic masculinity.
Interesting. Very very deep, David. Yeah.
I can't help it. I think about this stuff.
We spend all this time thinking about ElfQuest constantly. That's why we have podcasts.
Yes.
Get all of this out.
Yeah.
So, so I had another these are just more like I had them into kind of categories of just monsters, even though we've discussed that Mad Coil is very complex, but it's just a monster. It is like kind of just evil incarnate. And then there's some other creatures that are sort of like that. And then there's some monsters in ElfQuest that, like you said, they just maybe appear scary, certain characters, I should say, but they're misunderstood. And then finally, I have Winnowill. She's another whole other category all unto herself. So it has kind of broken up into those three. So some other just like purely scary creatures are I don't know if this has a name, but like those warped creatures that Winnowill created in the Wild Hunt.
Yeah.
and then they were like, a lot of the animals just kind of got, I don't know, infected by Winnow-Will's like dark magic, and they were coming after Ember's tribe. And then there was just this one giant one that was kind of leading the others. I don't know if it ever had a name. I was kind of looking
it never had a name. I think they just referred to it as like the master of the shape changed. And so so there's a lot. I have thoughts on this whole batch of creatures too. So, ElfQuest again doesn't have like your traditional fantasy creatures, right? So for that Wild Hunt storyline, this whole idea of Winnow-Will creating these creatures to sort of hunt the Wolf Riders, and they basically have like a mission given to them by Winnow-Will and Nightfall She-Wolf, who I believe is Shekinah.
That is Shekinah coming in on the chat.
And yes, that thing was terrifying. The character design, Steve Blevins was the artist on that series of that, and there's something about the face of it that is particularly terrifying. It's almost like it's got like a human quality to it. I don't know, but at any rate, that idea came up, like, let's have Winnow-Will have shape change these creatures to sort of go kill the Wolf Riders, which parallels what's happening over in sort of the sister series to Hidden Years, which was the Shards series, right? So Shards followed Cutter and his crew when they went to recover the Palace Shards after it got smashed, and Hidden Years followed Ember, right? So like right out of the gates, there's this cool parallel, because what are the Cutter's Wolf Riders facing? They're facing Peace Hounds, which are also super terrifying.
So gross too.
Right.
I think I have some pictures. I think there might be the next 2 slides. So this is the creature from Howling Rock. Some of these, it's like the animals get kind of mashed up together, so they're really unnatural looking, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
And then they're, out for blood and just looking for these poor elves that have the wolf blood, only them. So they're just like fixated on them.
They're truly scary. And again, Steve Blevins was the artist on this series, and I have to give him props for drawing really kind of scary looking monsters. And also, I really appreciate his handle on animal anatomy. I have sort of this checklist in my head of like, for an artist to, be able to do ElfQuest well, obviously they need to be able to draw elves. But I think it's equally important that they be able to draw animals, because ElfQuest is the settings are so natural, right? And Steve Blevins did a really good job with that. And then translating those animals into sort of the monster form. But I think the neatest thing about the shape changed, whether they're, that batch that were chasing Ember's tribe on the plains or the Peace Hounds, is that actually goes back to something Wendy and Richard, an idea that they came up with, that was a throwaway line, or really kind of like seeds, like Wendy and Richard like to do, all the way back in Kings of the Broken Wheel. So if you remember, at the end, Kings of the Broken Wheel, Rayek steals the palace into the future. The Wolf Riders sleep 10,000 years, right? Winnow-Will basically becomes her, goes into her mer form and lives under the waves, all of that. So there is that scene where Winnow-Will is sort of luring Rayek, now that he's appeared into the future, to where the palace is going to reappear. And she says something. Along the lines of, I've whiled away the 10,000 years, basically, working through my stuff and healing herself in many ways, right? Not fully, but she says also, something like, I pass the time by sending the humans playthings, something along those lines. I don't have it in front of me. And so basically the idea of Winnow-Will sending monsters to like basically, torment the humans is an idea that Wendy and Richard came up for Winnow-Will all the way back in Kings of the Broken Wheel. And it sort of lay fallow until the writers on those series, on the Hidden Years series, which was Joellen Aucklandis, and then Shards, which is Wendy and Richard themselves. They sort of pulled that thread that they sort of began weaving in all the way back in Kings of the Broken Wheel and really fully explored it in Hidden Years and Shards. And I just think that kind of stuff is so cool. You know, it wasn't just some random idea like, oh, let's throw a monster at Ember's tribe, right? It was like, well, this is an idea that, you know, Winnowill doing this as a way basically to sort of entertain herself. Mm-hmm. You know, it was already there in the story of ElfQuest. They just sort of explored it further. I think that's really neat.
That is neat. That is a good point. Yeah, I love the way that Wendy and Richard just like drop these little hints, and they weave it back into the story like decades later in just the best possible way. I mean, they are so good at what they do. I mean, there are writers that just cannot keep their story tight, and it'll go off on some tangent, and it'll never, like, the threads are just hanging there forever. And they're just so amazing. Yeah, that I'm getting like all excited all over again. Now I need to read Kings, and I love Kings. That's my favorite one.
Okay. Yeah. I knew that would excite you because it's not something that ever really gets talked about, right? I mean, it's not an aspect of the story that I quite honestly have ever seen anybody post about. I certainly didn't talk about it in any of the ElfQuest show podcast episodes. And so, yeah. So anyway, I think that's kind of neat. And, you know, those creatures showed up. They continue to show up after, you know, Lita kills the sort of the master of the shape changed, which we just saw that page where she basically zaps him. And there in the follow-up story to that, of course, was the Wild Hunt. And in the first sort of chapter of the Wild Hunt, we meet another absolutely horrific example of one of Winnowill's shape change monsters, and that's the Redeemer. You remember this?
Yeah, that story is super disturbing.
Yes.
Like, the town is feeding their kids to this monster. I don't like to think about it, so that's probably why I didn't bring it up, because it really
for anybody,
gives me the heebie-jeebies.
It really does. I mean, number one, the monster design is grotesque. It looks like a cross between like a whale, like a killer whale, and like a slug. Right? It's just this sort of long, I don't even know how to describe it. It's got tentacles, but it doesn't have eyes. It's got fangs. It's a pretty badass character design, and it's like the whole way, like it basically can spit like paralyzing juice, so that it like paralyzes whatever its prey is, so that it can't run, so that it can sort of slowly, you know, come in and devour it. And it was hardcore creepy. But again, I thought another really great storyline, which I believe, again, Joellen Aucklandis was the author of that. Because what that story really is about is exploring just sort of superstition, and I think sort of the dangers of dogma when it comes to sort of religious or cultural belief. You know, they were literally throwing this boy to this monster because he saw an elf, and no one else even saw this elf. Like it's sort of like the witch hunts, right, of Salem, where
yes, very
like,
true.
All that needs to happen is somebody needs to say like, oh, you're a witch, or in this case, oh, you saw an elf or an imp, you know, and that was enough for, like, you know, because again, they were essentially schooled by Winnowill. In that story, you see she basically emerges in her mer form as a goddess of the sea and basically tells these people, I'm sending you the Redeemer to save your souls, because if you see these imps or elves, your soul's going to go away. The only way to save them is to feed them to this monster. And meanwhile, Winnowill's laughing because it's just a way for her to sow, you know, evil and destruction and whatever, and to entertain her. And meanwhile, these poor people are just believing this, you know, and as a result, their whole society is just doing this horrific thing without ever questioning it. And so there's so many layers in that story of just heebie-jeebie inducing stuff, right? The creature itself, the character design, but really the underlying story of like what people are willing to do when they're not critical thinkers, right? When they're just taking what authority figures tell them at face value, and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, the
It's why
Redeemer's a really
people
creepy one.
very much. Thank you for because I had almost forgotten about that, but that was a really well written story, but it really did freak me out. Like,
Yeah.
gross. Like, sometimes I like to pretend it never happened, but
Well,
but
luckily
Winnowill is just behind so much drama and evil things in these ElfQuest stories.
A girl's got to keep busy over the course of 20,000 years of story, right? So
yeah, 20,000 years, and they weren't even gonna keep her.
That's
at the
right.
beginning of the story. I don't want to skip ahead because Winnowill is another thing, but yeah, I mean, just it's amazing. I think she's my favorite character in the sense that she's so complicated, and I just love all of the nuance about that character. I mean, I don't like her at all, but I love her. But
say
anyway.
no more. I know exactly what you mean. I mean, you can enjoy a character without liking them or endorsing them. I mean, look at like the queen baddie of them all, Maleficent, the original version.
Mm-hmm.
And I was starting to say earlier at the very beginning about how Wendy has really sort of taught me to appreciate just like a villain who is just pure evil and that doesn't need a redeeming story arc and doesn't need, sort of see it through their lens and whatever. And Maleficent is the example that Wendy really always goes to. Like, she's just evil incarnate, and that is delicious, right? And clearly there's some sort of DNA of Maleficent over in Winnowill,
Yes.
as just the person who chooses to be evil, and that's really Winnowill's whole story arc. But I know you wanna hold off before we get into good old Winnie.
Yeah. So there are some, but her hand is in a lot of these other kind of monstrous characters.
Yeah.
Like these kind of misunderstood characters that they're not really bad all the time, really. And one is not bad at all. I'm thinking of Reef, the broken one.
Yep.
That was another, while they were all sleeping, that she kind of lashed out at him and just, I don't know, just messed him up. This poor, unsuspecting sea elf. I think I have, well, before that, I had a picture of the hounds from Shards that we were talking about. I think, Yvette, I think that's the next slide. Oof. And these were just, yeah, it's the tail that could like,
yeah.
And it's so long. Like, that's the other thing. Like, it's just so unnatural.
Yeah. They're definitely a creepy design. Brandon McKinney was the artist on the Shard series. And again, I don't know if he designed them or if it was a design that Wendy and Richard came up with, or Wendy came up with that then Brandon kind of ran with. But yeah, they're definitely creepy. And I think the creepiest scene with them is when they kill the gentle old man, who is actually sort of, it's an interesting counter. And again, this is all just coming to me in the moment, but we were just talking about the story of the Redeemer and how that human society was basically, sort of demonized elves, and to the point where they would kill themselves if they thought that they saw them, right? Over in Shards, there was that one scene where the setting is that Gromel Jun has basically declared himself a god and has banned the worship of the old gods or any other religions. And amongst the people of that part of the world, they do have sort of a reverence and an awe for the hidden ones, which are the elves, right? And especially among sort of like the common folks. So I think of the woodcutter befriending Talit. And so anyway, there's this old guy, and he's like, you know what? I've been around. I'm going to bury basically sort of the images, the carved images of the hidden ones, so that the grandbabes one day will know, like, that they're actually real and they exist, and all of that. And he's like trying to hide them away. And it's just this cute little old man. And the peace hounds come, and because they can sense sort of him sort of celebrating the wolf riders and whatever, and they basically like devour him, sort of dismember him, and they don't show it on camera. And that is, I think, the actual creepiest part, because it's just in silhouette and you just see the giant bulging gnarly eyes of the peace hounds and their ravenous jaws, and you see blood in the guy's little hand or whatever. Like, ooh, it's so horrible. So horrible.
There are so many real life lessons from all of the stories of ElfQuest, and there's even too many to like list out. Like, you just got to start reading it, folks, if you haven't started already, because
preach.
You are so right. I mean, of course I remember, but like, you're bringing up all of these things, like, and sometimes I would say, like, when I get into like the later ones, I mean, obviously, like a lot of fans, I reread like the first, I don't know, through Kings of the Broken Wheel, like over and over again. But once I started like doing this podcast and doing the research and stuff, I mean, I get sucked in like at every time, like, oh my God, I forgot about that. Like, there's just so many good, just story arcs, so many lessons, so many like allegories that are, I mean, it's so prophetic, because all of it is so relevant for right now.
It really is. Yeah. And I like to think of it just as like the one word that I would use to sort of collect everything that you were just saying is there's wisdom in it. It's not preachy, right? The stories aren't like beating you over the head, and they're not handled in a ham-fisted kind of way, right? Like, there's complexity and there's subtlety, and like there is sort of a message to many stories in ElfQuest, and there are cautionary tales, and there are sort of like modeling good and bad behavior, that we can learn from in the real world. But it's all part of this rich story that's entertaining. And I think that's really the magic of ElfQuest. It's that it's good storytelling, it's amazing art, and it like the stories, though they're fantasy, ring true. And that, I think, is when fantasy is really good, right? When it doesn't matter that these are fictional creatures in a world that doesn't exist. It's like, it's real, right? Like, you read these stories and you feel it, and you have an intellectual response as well. And it doesn't get more real than that, or more true than that, regardless of whether or not it's physically real. So it's one of the things that has kept me an ElfQuest fan for going on 40 years, which is insane.
Yeah, me too.
Almost. I started reading in 85, so next year will be 40 years.
Wow. Well, happy anniversary for that. So so good. So onto these misunderstood monstery type characters. The first one we're introduced to after Mad Coil, I would say, is Tildak, the flying elf. He's sort of bat-like, and Winnowill shaped him into this form because he wanted to be able to fly. So, I mean, it's a very good, like, sincere desire to have this form. So he wanted to fly in the sky high up, just like the hawks. He didn't want to have to ride on the hawk. And Winnowill shaped him into this form. I believe we have a slide for this so you can see her, and I think she enjoyed the pain of it a little bit.
Oh, 100%. Look at the look on her face in that central panel there.
Yeah.
She's just like almost like humming to herself, because Winnowill is a healer, and that's what allows her to shape the flesh. So she has the ability to do that in a way that Tildak doesn't feel anything, but he's in utter agony. So she's allowing that to happen and perfectly happy about it. Winnowill obviously when Tildak says to her, I want to fly like the great hawks, right? She didn't shape him into a bird form that, to our eyes as readers would just be a little bit more beautiful and elegant, right? She
Yeah.
chose to model him off of a bat, which makes him look just sort of skeletal and scary. And yes, Simone, like pulling him apart like silly putty. Um,
Oh, it's a
and
great image.
so he looks bat-like, he looks sort of pterodactyl-like, which is of course I think the origin of his name,
Mm-hmm.
dactyl, tildak, he's sort of evocative of these flying reptiles or bats or whatever. And the thing that I think is most fascinating about Tildak is that the thing that makes us talk about him in an episode about monsters is that it's purely the visual.
Right.
And the Wolf Riders have the same exact reaction and sort of journey of coming to question that knee-jerk reaction to Tildak that we the readers have ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, right? So like when the Wolf Riders first meet him, they are grossed out by him. Oh, what is that monster, right? He has
Right.
no hands, and they even say that, right? Like and it's sort of mirrored because Tildak at that point in the story, is sort of a villain, right? He is a henchman of Winnowill. And as the story progresses in that first story arc of Blue Mountain, he does some bad things, but he also, like, you also then glimpse him through the other side of just like sort of just an elf, and he's trying to get by and do his thing. And and so pretty quickly, I think, they never really address it. Like no one ever has a conversation in the story like, oh, I used to think you were a gross monster, but now I realize that all of us are potential shape changers and we can look however we want, right? That never happened as a conversation, but clearly, post the original quest, the elves really did just accept Tildak as, just in the form that is closest to what his soul wants to be, right? Even though
Right.
sort of a monstrous form given to him by Winnowill, to the point where now in sort of the modern time frame of ElfQuest, we have elves in all sorts of shapes that are outside
Right.
of that traditional elf form. You mentioned Reef, and I'm guessing you want to talk about him next, but he's another great example of that, where the elves just sort of accept him in his monster form in a way that they didn't with Tildak in the initial phase, just like the readers. So,
Right. Yes. And Dushine always saw him as his original form,
right,
when they have that one panel where that's how she sees him and how he sees her, but he's not able to see past her wolf blood, which I always kind of bothered me a little bit about him, that he couldn't see more of her soul as just like him. Like it
well,
was
yeah, but think about it. Tildak is an elf, right? So on the World of Two Moons, his sort of birth form is that sort of elfin form that he appeared to Dushine as. That's sort of what his sort of the physical embodiment of his soul. Dushine, because she's a wolf rider, is actually part wolf.
mhm,
She's got some wolf DNA in her. And so I always understood that to be like that is what a wolf rider's spirit soul kind of looks like.
interesting. Huh.
And even though their outer form, sort of looks like any other elf. Whereas Tildak, his shape is just that. It's just his shape, right? Like the being itself is still just an elf. So that's why she sees him that way. Why his spirit looks that way. Um,
Hmm.
but you make me think too that I gotta guess that some of that is also choice and perception on Tildak's part, right?
Yeah, but you have given me a new way of thinking about it. So it's that wolf blood that goes into her soul name, basically.
Right.
It's
Yeah. Yeah.
all part of her essence. So
Right.
that is
Because
deep.
wolf
That's
riders are
interesting.
different than all of the other elves, right?
Yeah.
Because they have the sort of the wolf heritage via Tamain, and Timoran actually, really. And so that is how I always understood that. But again, like, we don't see that happen with any other sort of recognized couples, which, doesn't mean that they're not seeing their Wolf Rider partners in that same way. But I think it's not an issue because Tildak, for Tildak, it was a problem, I guess, right?
Right. It was a problem because it's not a problem for Lita, and she's, I don't know,
but
maybe
it
because
was
she's
a
a
problem for me.
healer. It was like he smelled like a dog and
Right.
all of those
And
things.
go back and read the first story arc of ElfQuest, and keep in mind that Lita she's touched him, right? She knows that there's wolf blood there. She probably is seeing Cutter in that sort of wolfish form. And in fact, now that I'm saying that, think back to Lita's sort of nightmare in the original quest after the trial of Head, Hand, and Heart, and the Wolf Riders are having their howl. Lita's sleeping in her bed. She's woken up. And then she goes up and she eavesdrops and hears the whole story of Mad Coil and everything. And that comes to give her a better understanding and empathy for the Wolf Riders. But think of that dream sequence. She's actually responding to Cutter basically morphing into a wolf. And you do see sort of a hairy, wolfish, version of Cutter that now I'm thinking she probably could see him in that way. And that dream was that aspect of Cutter terrifying her and coming through her subconscious. Wow. Yeah. So Draco Dawn Stars, that's Natalie, I think,
That's
right?
Natalie, yep.
Totally. Lita, she sort of saw Cutter in that form. That's what I'm thinking right now as I'm talking. I think that meshes really nicely with everything that we're talking about why Tildak and Dewshine saw each other that way, and why later recognitions, it's just not a big deal because there's already like sort of a level of acceptance and knowledge of what Wolf Riders are in a way that there wasn't at that point in the story earlier. So,
True.
So yeah, all of it. I think that's a two-way street, really, of like allowing our kind of perceptions and prejudices dictate who is a monster and who isn't, right? The Wolf Riders saw Tildak as a monster just because he looked different. Tildak sort of perceived Dewshine as a monster because he was shocked at that, she had this sort of animal element to her, but she's still an elf, right? So once he got over that, it was no big deal, and vice versa. So, wow, lots of complexity.
Yes, very complex. Okay, so let's go on to Reef. Poor but awesome Reef. So Winnowill, I guess he's exploring in the seas, and this is during the time when the Wolf Riders are sleeping, and Winnowill is her merself, and she kind of just lashes out her warping energy and she just really messes him up, because I don't think it wasn't and they touch on this in Final Quest, that she was just kind of lashing out like indiscriminately, like just it wasn't one of her targeted, I'm gonna I'm gonna mess with this one individual elf on purpose.
Right. And it actually wasn't during the long sleep.
It wasn't. Oh, okay.
It was right after the events of Siege of Blue Mountain, when Tildak, Winnowill is half healed, Blue Mountain has fallen. Tildak snatches Winnowill, who's now wrapped up in a preserver cocoon, essentially to get his revenge because she had him chained up and he was no longer going to be her slave, right? He steals her, and Cutter and Lita are like, no, you can't kill her. Her spirit's going to come out and kill everyone, right? He flies off away from Blue Mountain and dumps her on that tiny little coastal island in the vast deep sea.
Oh, so that's when it happened?
That's when it happened. So Winnowill is half healed. She's completely bonkers and, sort of dealing with all of the trauma that she has buried, that Lita sort of brought to the surface through the healing process, but then it got interrupted. So Lita couldn't help her heal. So now she's,
raw,
basically insane,
raw
and whatever. And so she's trapped on this little island. And who should bop along but exploring Reef and he senses her and her magic, and he pops up on the island, and she turns around and is like, ah, and zaps him and turns him into the broken one, right? So that's when that all happened, because right after that, in the beginning of Kings, which happens immediately after Siege, she gets her act together enough. She's starving, her clothes are in tatters, she's just stuck on this island, and she's like, all right, I'm turning into a fish, and she changes into the fish, her guild form, and goes under the sea. That is when Reef actually got turned into the Broken One. And then 500 years passed before the Wolf Riders went into their long sleep. So Reef is old.
Wow. I don't know why I never put that together exactly.
Well, and here's where I'm
getting the Wave Dancers a little like the stories are
right.
Not very linear.
Yeah.
So
the stories of the Wave Dancer stories before Wendy and Richard really sort of took over telling the story, I think, are a little bit inconsistent. Yeah. And so is the art. And so, that is what it is. That was sort of the 90s era, and the Wave Dancer series was being told as part of the anthology comic, and it was a little bit different than sort of like targeted beginning, middle, end storytelling that a lot of the other series had.
Yeah.
But at any rate, in that chapter of the Wave Dancers, the serial stories that were, sort of drawn in black and white, that is where we first see the scene of Reef turning into the Broken One. And Winnowill is in her Blue Mountain outfit, and she's got this mad, crazed look, and she's on the little island. So that's how I know that in the chronology that is when Reef became the Broken One. It wasn't later when she was just swimming under the sea, because at that point, when she went into the sea, she basically spent decades, centuries, millennia working on herself and coming to terms with all of the harm that she had caused in her stagnation and all of that kind of stuff, and ultimately came out the other end, not sort of making atonement for her wrongs, but instead going in the exact opposite direction and embracing it and saying, you know what, this is who I am. I am clear-minded. I'm not mad anymore, right? In terms of like insane or whatever. I'm not wounded. I'm not, stagnated and all of those things that she was in Blue Mountain. She is now just a cold, hard bitch out to hurt and reject. Yeah. That's the transition that happens, during the long wait with Winnowill. And that's why, coming out on that end of the story, why her randomly shape-changing creatures into brutal monsters and just becoming sort of that really sort of arch villain level super villain in the ElfQuest story, like, it's not just, oh yeah, let's make Winnowill the big baddie. Like, there is a narrative character development that happens with her that takes her from, again, sort of the crazy person who is stagnant and, all of that stuff that she was in Blue Mountain, to, the character that essentially is teaming up with Grumble John basically to kill and annihilate anybody she doesn't like and use everybody around her so she can get the shards and really just gain more power. And why her spirit was so dangerous, because she didn't care. Like, what she wanted to do was hurt and cause harm because she was entertained by it, right? And so anyway, Winnowill really is a monster in many ways because she's chosen to be a monster.
Yeah. I mean, exactly, yes. But the journey to become this, like, I want to be this monster is fascinating to me. Yeah. I just think it's so interesting. But okay, so we've already started talking about Winnowill. We had some other monster. I mean, I want to show Reef because I just love the character design of how, well, this is Two Edge, Winnowill's son.
There's Reef.
Here's Reef. First, he's the broken one. And this is when she just lashed out in raw, like, energy. And then, so his elf power is that he was a shapeshifter. And this other form, that is the true form that he was supposed to have as a defender for his tribe of sea elves.
Right.
And I love that the way that his character developed that way, because first, in the first form, he's broken, he's the broken one, and Serge uses him as this example, like, this is why you should be afraid of the outside world and you should just stay right here and not venture
I want to interrupt
out.
you. And Sabrina's comment about Reef being kind of hot. All of you monster lovers out there, this is it, right? Reef is sexy.
He is hot.
I
And
don't know
Wendy,
why, but he is.
it's sort of Wendy's version of, is it the creature from the Black
Yes.
Lagoon?
Yep.
And she had said that was like one of her favorite characters.
I think Wendy's favorite sort of monster is the creature from the Black Lagoon. And if you read like The Line of Beauty, The Art of Wendy Peeney, Wendy has always had sort of that affinity for sort of mer people. Triton from the Marvel universe was a character that she really kind of gravitated to, and has done some artwork of. And you kind of see echoes of that in her version of Snakeskin, with his scaly skin, and and then all the wave dancers with their fin-like ears and whatever. And so, yeah, it all kind of it sort of culminates in sort of this monster form of Reef. And yeah, it's really cool. I love that, just again, that whole narrative that takes us from Reef the elf, again, the explorer, the shape changer, the healer, reaching out to Winnowill, getting blasted and mutated into this monster that was broken in mind and body. He's got half tentacles, and he kind of squelches around, like he is kind of gross, right? Like you
There's
feel
that one he's like him. Trying to like lick
exactly right,
like a
he's
snail or something.
Yeah. And so but he's always pitiable, right? Like you feel very sad for him, but like he doesn't have a way out, right? And so when I saw that panel that we were just looking at, where Reef finally gets healed, and the collective power of the healers are able to break through and bring him back to his elfin form. And Reef is just so interesting in that elfin form. He's so innocent. He's this ancient elf, but like he spent so long, 10,000 years basically, in the Broken One form, that he just doesn't really know who to be. And there's something very childlike about him, and something very wounded about him, that just makes you want to hug him, and like protect him. And he's very fragile. And the elves sort of treat him that way. Like they care for him, and they're like, let him be what he's going to be, and whatever. So when I never saw it coming in a million years, what would happen to him is that he would then actually embrace a monster form, right? And the most powerful part about it is that line in that panel when he's revealed as that sea monster form, right? Is, I wasn't broken, I was unfinished. And I'm getting chills, right? What powerful storytelling. Like, I take that with me when I'm feeling like the world is against me, or like I can't win, and that spirit of, I'm not broken, maybe I'm not finished yet, right? I have more work to do. And and of course his whole personality changes in that form. He goes from being this sort of very meek, sort of shrinking violet who needs protection, to this like badass, muscle bound protector, right? That is going to punch holes in the hulls of warships when they come and threaten his people. And yeah, he's sexy.
Yes, and he forgave Winnowill for,
oh my god, yeah,
for doing that to him, and that broke her down.
Yeah.
Like, she could not take it. She can't take forgiveness because she is so committed to being this evil, dark character.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that whole plot element and storyline within the final quest just kicks me in the stomach every time I read it. It's so good,
It's so
you
good.
know, and just sort of the commitment to treating people, others as best we can, as sort of the ideal that is sort of elevated in ElfQuest. It's it's so good. It's like why I love ElfQuest. It's so rare in fantasy, where so much fantasy is about um, the powerful and beating down the evil. And this is just a totally different ballpark, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like overcoming the big giant evil enemy with simple love and forgiveness, right? And how shocking that is, even to the characters in the story. You
Right.
know, I mean, Reef could have turned into he already was in his monster form, right? He could have squeezed Rayek, you know, until Winnowill, sort of got squeezed out, and then he could have devoured her. Like he could have done that. Like he's a magical elf, but instead he's like, "Oh, you didn't hurt me on purpose. I've spent all of these years being victimized because I thought you were maliciously hurting me, and turns out that you were just broken, and I was just sort of collateral damage. Oh wow, I forgive you." And Winnowill had no idea what to do with that.
Yeah. Could
You
not
know?
could not take it. Yes,
Yeah.
Simone and Winkin also forgave
Yeah,
Winnowill,
absolutely. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
she couldn't really handle that either. That was so twisted what she did. I mean, we've been talking for almost an hour and I have other characters, but I
I know.
mean,
I'm
let's get
sorry.
into Winnowill. And I mean, she does this to Winkin. Winkin is the child of Dushine and Tildak, and he gets kidnapped as a newborn baby elf. And Winnowill removes his wolf blood by like as she's nursing him. It's so creepy.
Yes. Yeah. It's sort of like a violation of sort of the like of motherhood, right? Like, and that,
Yes.
I mean, I can only imagine it, not like, I've never had that experience, right? As a man, like I can't give birth to a baby and nurse it, right? And so I can only imagine what that bond feels like. And, it seems to be one of the most powerful sort of bonds and relationships and emotional connections that two human beings can have, right? And so the way that Winnowill just corrupts it, and not only that, is why she's doing it, right? Like the reasoning behind it is just as bad as like the act of doing it. Why is she doing it? Well, she's doing it because she has this notion of like purity, right? Like pure
Mhm.
blood. And if you're not a pure blood elf, which the Wolf Riders aren't because they have, sort of genetically commingled with the wolves to better survive on this planet, she has deemed them mongrels and impure. It's like eugenics in its worst form.
Yes.
And
Yes,
so
they're
she's
inferior and must be cleansed.
right. So she's basically like she is corrupting one of the most intimate, pure sort of bonds or relationships that two human beings can have, mother and child and offspring feeding, right, with her own body, to basically commit an act of like eugenics on this poor innocent baby that doesn't even know, right? And she knows that he might not even survive it. She's like,
Yep.
oh, this is an experiment. Just like the poor Treewee that we see in the bowels of Blue Mountain during the original quest with one wing, kind of like Tildat's wing, right? Like, that was just Winnowill being bored one day. And this captured little Treewee became the sort of the victim of her boredom, where I kind of just like I picture her like talking on the phone, eating
Right.
bonbons, and like passively just torturing this little creature over here, and it's the same thing with Winkin, she's like, oh well, I've got this thing now. Let's play around with it in this horrible way, and maybe it'll live, maybe it won't, and it's just, oh, it's so
It's so
callous.
bad. I mean, because even on the surface, just this other like person nursing another child that's not yours is creepy already. That's in like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, that movie. I mean, that
Yeah.
it just freaks me out. But then also, yeah, she's doing that, like she's waiting till he's starving and like distracted so that she can like work the magic. And it's just one of the like evilest things I've ever seen. But she's already like bastardized motherhood from what she did to her own child, for what she
Right.
did with Two Edge, which
Yeah.
was another impure, quote unquote, like creation. She seduced this troll. What was it? Smelt?
Smelt. Yes.
And has this child, this hybrid, half elf, half troll. And then she just plays mind games with him. She tortures him until he goes insane.
Yeah. I mean, she put him in a cage. Like what she did to Winkin, in the story, we see that happen first, and we're all like squicky about it. But later in Siege of Blue Mountain, we get the full story of what she did to Two Edge. And man, talk about a character that was first introduced really as a villain.
Mhm.
This is an example of seeing the story through the villain's eyes, and then having a lot more empathy for that villain. And you don't see them quite so much as a villain or a monster, right? You see them as a victim, as someone that you might have pity for or empathy with. And yeah, Winnowill, like you said, like tortured her own child, put him in a cage, basically made him mentally broken and insane, and tortured him, made him watch as she killed his father, right? So she's pretty bad. She's pretty bad.
But that broke her too, because like that was part of what Lita
Right.
was supposed to try to heal in her, is that she saw that moment when she broke her own child's mind. Did we lose David?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. All right, mine. Yeah, I mean, it's just so gut-wrenching. I mean, I always kind of felt sympathy for Two Edge. He was a tragic character. I mean, he manipulates this entire war just to kind of try to figure out what's going on in his own mind of the two parts of him.
Right.
And that just resonated so much with the way people feel when you kind of feel othered, like where do I belong? And it's sad that he had to like have it play out in this like actual war.
Right.
So it's like this war within has to manifest in this external war between these two groups of beings. I mean, again,
Yeah.
it's just such good storytelling. It's
Yeah,
so
it really is.
good.
And that's exactly what I was just going to say. Like the creativity for Wendy and Richard to sort of come up with these ideas and then execute them so well. And to do it over the course of decades, these through lines, these stories of these characters, they're the same characters as they were, 45 plus years ago, right? But they've grown and they've changed, and sometimes not for the better, i.e. Winnowill. But think about Two Edge today, and his story arc in the final quest. It's not even a redemption story arc, right? Like there wasn't anything for him to really be redeemed for, not for a very long time, right? He's sort of just kind of been there doing his thing, sometimes an ally, sometimes an adversary. But in Final Quest, he really, I feel like, kind of broke through. And it was largely because of kindness, right? It was because Audrey actually treated him with kindness. And then, we know what happened there if we've read the Final Quest, which is just like, oh.
Yeah, he's a girlfriend.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh,
So,
Sabrina, you should definitely get the Flesk Art of ElfQuest books, because they do have some of the storyboards for sort of behind the scenes. Some of them are in other in the like the backs of issues and in
yep.
the main books, but yeah.
Yeah, actually, one of the best
Always
books to get if you're interested.
I
Well,
don't know if
yes,
you can still
there's
get
that one, but
that.
I was going to say The Art of the Story, where it's one of the Flesk publication ElfQuest book. It's ElfQuest: The Art of the Story, and it's basically 5 individual issues of ElfQuest where you see sort of like the unfinished page, and then you see the finished page. And Wendy and Richard are have commented on it. There's commentary on each of the pages. So that's a good one. I don't think it's the storyboard so much as the just sort of the art without the lettering and everything, so you can see the pure art. But anyway,
And
there's
the
a lot of
layouts.
that, Tanya.
I do love the like layouts where it's just like kind of these rough sketches. Like this is
Yeah,
just how it's supposed to sort of look, and then it just gets all tightened up and all the beautiful finishes happen. It's
totally. Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much. Okay. So yeah, so Winnowill, she breaks poor Two Edge, and then, you know, as you said, she just decides evil is the way to go. And it starts because she has these gifts and she can't use them. Like
Yeah.
that is the small tragedy where you kind of feel sorry for her, because she is this powerful healer, and the elves of Blue Mountain have locked themselves up in this mountain, and there's no threats, and nobody needs her anymore. And that she goes insane because
Right.
she can't do anything. Like there's nothing to do. She's like creating accidents, like Munchausen syndrome by proxy, so that she
Yes.
can kind of get some attention and do something.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
wild.
and use her skills, right? And that's exactly right. And after a few thousand years of that, like you begin to it sort of changes you, right? And that's where again the beginning of Winnowill's quote unquote madness, you know, her insanity, right? Her whatever words you wanted to use to describe that, where like she's unable to function in a sort of a healthy way any longer. And then that just sort of exacerbates and kind of grows in on itself. And she has these moments in the story where, you know, we learn these through flashbacks, where she's like, you know what, we got to get out of this mountain, right? We're stagnating here. Let's go find the palace. And Lord Vol is like so safe and happy. He's like, no way. And that's when she leaves Blue Mountain to go find the palace and to reinvigorate the gliders, right? And all of that good stuff. Like her intentions were totally good, right? And that's when she saw the troll who was dying, and her healer, her addiction to her own power as a healer kind of kicked in, and like the whole palace quest went out the window, and she squirrels this wounded troll into, you know, the hidden bowels of Blue Mountain and heals him, and then feeds off of his need for all these years, you know, the whole Two Edge, you know, seducing and whatever, Two Edge is born. And when the troll comes to, you know, his senses, and he's like, what the heck am I doing here? I was actually sent to go steal rock shapers
Right.
like in Greymong. And he tries to steal Door the rock shaper. And that's when Winnowill really just snaps and literally uses her magic to obliterate and melt him right before Two Edge's eyes. Right. And then Two Edge was like, I'm going to go tell Lord Vol. And that's when she had probably Door put Two Edge into a cage, and then she spent however long torturing him, and I guess eventually she set him free once his mind was broken. We never actually got that particular story, but yeah, there's a logic to it all, right? It's like you can see how it happened, and that, like you said, torturing Two Edge was the thing that really, I think, drove her over the edge, right? And that was what Lita at the end of Siege of Blue Mountain had sort of brought to the surface. Like, I mean, we all know, like when we have traumatic things, we bury them. We don't want to cope with them. We don't want to deal with them. You know, and that's why we go to therapists, right, to sort of help with that. So Lita was healing Winnowill and helping her process all that, but it was interrupted. And that's where she was facing all of the horrors that she did when Tildak dumped her on the island, and then poor Reef swims along, right? But shoot, I had something else I was going to say about that, but I've lost the thought. So back to you.
It's okay. Yeah, I mean, what I love about the character of Winnowill is all of this evil, dark feeling. None of it is coming from these kind of traditional, like, bad woman tropes. She's not a jilted lover and she's not jealous like that. It doesn't come from any of those places. And that's why I think she's so interesting, and it's such a great, wicked, dark character because it's all coming from her. Like, she's just made herself this way.
Right.
And it's also kind of a message about, when you have these gifts and you let them fester, like, you don't use them, and they get neglected and they turn on you. And
Right.
so you got to kind of keep growing. You can't stagnate and just try to stay safe, because there is no safety, really. You just got to kind of live your life. You got to.
And that is one of the bigger messages of ElfQuest, is like, you just got to embrace life. Like, you can't hide from the world, right? And there's a lot of magic and experience, even if there is danger of being harmed, both physically or emotionally or whatever. Like, that's what life is about. You can hide away, and then what do you get out of that, right? You miss out on everything, and you might even stagnate, like Winnowill did. In some ways, you're right. Winnowill's story really is not anything like the trope of the woman villain, right? If anything, Winnowill's story, you can look at it, from the perspective of her story, really is, at least the origin of how she got to be how she is sort of a cautionary tale of trying to suppress powerful women and not let them use their power, right?
Right. Yes.
That's really her story, and you never see that, right? It's so yeah, Winnowill definitely super fascinating.
Yeah, I could just go on forever about all of this stuff. So yeah, she's had her hand in all of these other monsters that we've talked about tonight, and she just keeps on going. She's still haunting poor Rayek, even though in spirit, even though her body is dead, her spirit is living on and is trapped in Rayek's body, I guess, which is also kind of terrifying when you think about it, to have your own. I mean, it's so scary, the Rogue's Curse series, when he gets tired, he goes to sleep, and she takes over.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is nothing more terrifying than not having control over your own body and not knowing what you did, and if to have done something horrible that you can't control, that you can't stop. And like,
yeah, I mean, it's sort of ElfQuest version of demonic possession. And this is one thing that I wanted to say, and I know we're probably going to need to wrap here shortly, but as I was thinking, when you invited me on to talk about monsters, I wanted to just make one point in particular, and that is that what's really neat about ElfQuest, one of the things that's really neat about ElfQuest, is that it's kind of like a fairy tale told from the perspective of the monsters.
mm-hmm.
Because if you think about it, in ElfQuest, many of the human cultures and human societies are afraid of the elves, right? They think of them as monsters or demons, right? And so one of my favorite things about ElfQuest is how Wendy and Richard in the storytelling have sort of like given a story, like an origin for many of like human myths about monsters. And they turn out, when you know the real story, like, it's totally not what the myth says, right? So like, I've done many years ago, I did a series of social media posts about ElfQuest characters as traditional Halloween monsters. And so this is sort of
that.
What's that?
I looked at that for research.
Oh yeah, okay. So like, I love this, right? It's like ElfQuest doesn't have werewolves. It's got Timor and Yellow Eyes and Timane, right? who are able to shape into sort of a wolfish form, right? And so human cultures that might see that could be the origin of the concept or the myth of werewolves, right? Winnowill isn't a demon from hell. This is her sort of disembodied spirit of a character that we know as a person, and it's actually being held prisoner by Rayek, of course, because she's the worst kind of criminal there is, and she deserves to be in prison. But so there's just so many things like that. I mean, just again, the idea of elves and all the myths that we have in the real world about elves being mischievous and elves stealing your babies, right? We see Bearclaw doing that, right?
Literally.
Right. And like swapping, the story of Little Patch, right, is really the story of, and sort of like, Northern European mythology of the changeling, right, where the fairies steal your baby and replace it with a fairy and then raise your baby amongst the fairies. And so when he comes back into the human world, they don't like him. They don't, so it's like, again, the ElfQuest version of some of these kind of traditional fantasy and fairy tale things that we know from 1,000,001 other iterations of them, but they're always told from the point of view of like the people, right? It's never from the point of view of the monster, right? The monster or the creature or the, whatever, right? And there's just so many examples of that throughout ElfQuest, and I just think it's really neat.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, we have been chatting for quite some time. I think we should wrap it up, but I hope you will come back again onto Two Moons and a Microphone, because I love geeking out with you, David.
Oh, Tanya, you don't even have to ask. So just let me know. Give me an hour's notice, and I will be in front of the camera with you.
I'm like, fantastic. Okay, so okay, so I have some business or housekeeping to mention. That next week on Wednesday, Sin Goes Sci-Fi is going to review Blade Runner, the original one, with legendary director David Livingston. And my last show is going to be November 27th. I'm working on a concept. I think I'm going to be talking about the elven forms and looking ripped, and how it's not really realistic to look like that. I'm going to bring in my trainer, D'Angelo Kennard, and we're going to talk about what it takes to get that elfin body. And should you? Probably not, but right before Thanksgiving, and we're going to pig out. So we're going to talk about just the elven form and like what these actors have to go through to look like superheroes, and how it's just not really realistic, and some better things that you can do to stay healthy. So thank you so much for coming on, David. Everybody, please like and subscribe to SyFy Sistas Inc. This is a SyFy Sistas Inc. production. So thank you all for coming out. I saw all of your wonderful discussions in the chat, but my computer was not letting me partake in the chat today. So I will be back next time. So thank you so much, David, and thank you all in the chat. And we will see you next time. Shade and Sweet Water.
Shade and Sweet Water.